This is Continuum Drag, a weekly podcast revisiting television sci-fi, fantasy, and everything in between. This week, The Martian Chronicles, Part 2.
Wilder's mind is a confusion of troubled thoughts. Thoughts about the dead Martian who might have taught them something of the planet they're living on. Thoughts of the planet they have left behind. The world about to face its final war.
Welcome to Continuum Drag, the podcast attending the Martian Orthodox Church. I'm Luke, here with my co-host Jordan. What's real, Jordan?
I have a question back for you. Should we open a Western-themed restaurant on Mars? Does that seem like a good business idea?
That seemed like just the best business idea I could think of. If I were one of the first men on Mars, that was what I would do for sure.
This is getting off topic a little bit, but I don't know if you both noticed the logo or the sign for the restaurant was a guy, like a cowboy riding on a rocket. And I thought, money well spent.
Well, we'll get to that very late in this episode.
Yeah, it's literally the last 10 minutes of the episode, I think.
This week, we are joined by a guest to talk about the Martian Chronicles. Welcome to the show. It's Dr. Phil Nichols, editor for the new Ray Bradbury Review, and an advisor at the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies, a man who can tell us all about Ray Bradbury and this miniseries. Welcome to the show, Phil.
Hi, it's good to be here.
So, I'm assuming, given that you have a PhD in the sort of, I believe it's the screenwriting of Ray Bradbury?
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
I mean, this isn't written by Ray Bradbury, but I know from reading about it, he had a lot of thoughts about it. And I think he as a screenwriter, had his own opinions on this film. So I'm very curious if you have any kind of like background on Ray Bradbury and the making of this.
Well, it goes back a hell of a long way because the book came out in the 1950s and he was trying to get a film made as early as 1955, I think.
Oh, wow.
He wrote his first screenplay for it around 57, and then all through the early 60s he was trying to get the film made, and he was just fighting a losing battle. But he wrote probably 3 complete screenplays in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, really? So there are 3 other versions of this he's written?
Oh, yes, at least. And he wrote some more after this as well.
So this was something he really felt pretty passionately about, and then he did not get to write it.
Well, he did have the opportunity to write this one, but he chose not to because he was pretty burned out on it by this point.
Oh,
He'd also, the year before this one started, he had done his stage play version, which was very successful in Los Angeles. And I think he felt that he'd exhausted his ability to do anything with the material at that point.
Oh, man. I would be very interested in seeing a stage play version of this. Well, Phil, we like to ask guests when they come on the podcast the first time, what's your sort of like background? How did you become a fan of science fiction?
I grew up with it all around me, I think. I mean, my childhood is mostly memories of television, of Batman, Star Trek, Lost in Space, all of those sorts of things, which were on constantly when I was a child. And so I was fully immersed in science fiction on the screen long before I read any. And then Bradbury was the first author that I read, and you can get this stuff in books as well. So
This is a very familiar story to me. This is very much, I'm also just watched a lot of TV, and then I'm like, no, I like this. Maybe I can read about it.
Yeah.
Well, that's great, because that makes you perfect for this. If you liked things on the TV screen that was science fiction, that's very much what this is all about. So good news. Well, I mean, I don't know. Do you have any last things before we get into the episode, either of you?
Probably this is not too relevant for the listeners, but I'm just curious what you made of the first episode, because I'm here to talk while you discuss episode 2. But what's the story so far? What's the story so far?
We have not released the last episode yet, so you have no idea what we thought. I mean, I will say this: we came into the first episode pretty blind. I was very, very surprised how much I enjoyed it. It was like I had read that Bradbury had called the script, like at a press conference before it came out, he called it boring, and then they had to push the release date because he would had torpedoed it so badly. But when I watched it, I'm like, oh, I'm really enjoying this little first part of this miniseries. I was surprised how much I enjoyed it.
Right. Of course, this is after they had tinkered with it to make it better.
Oh, I see. So there was perhaps a boring version of it available.
I think so. An even more boring version.
Well, I mean, I think I liked it as well, and I wouldn't say it's action-packed. It's not like there's a laser fight at the end and stuff, but I thought in terms of a science fiction that was more about ideas and more about concepts and more about humanity as a whole reflected through this mission, I thought it was effective. Now, it's not a blockbuster by any means, but I liked the first episode, and it may be a good segue into the second one, because the second one has a similar sort of pacing and tone to it, but the actual content of these, I think I called them vignettes of the first episode, which is a little bit more chopped up. It's this one's a little bit different.
I think the first episode was definitely a high point for us. I think we both gave 7.5. We were quite liked it.
Wow. That's
so
good to know.
We perhaps don't agree with Ray Bradbury on that part, but we'll see. I mean, maybe he changed his mind after he saw it. I somehow doubt it, but well, then
you mean when he saw Rock Hudson delivering those lines, he said, "All right, I take back everything I say."
Well, without further ado, let's get into episode 2. Here's the IMDb summary for part 2, The Settlers. With native Martians wiped out by disease, thousands of humans now colonize the Red Planet and attempt to create a second Earth. And this one begins, I mean, the effects are very, lo-fi in some ways. I mean, that's not true. They're just very, 1980s, not a lot of necessarily money for TV, but, the miniature work, I think, worked really well. And this one, in particular, starts with just, all these, huge silver rockets just, flying away from Earth toward Mars. And it's, I really loved it. It's a great way to open this episode. I thought it was just such a effective image when this episode started off. I was already excited to come back to this world.
And we're going to find out really quickly that Colonel John Wilder from the first episode, did they call him, what was his actual position? They called him Chief Coordinator or something?
Yeah.
Because he's like a mayor type figure.
Yeah, I understand he's now moved up from the Mars Mission Control to Mars to be, you're right, it's Chief Coordinator of Mars is his title.
Right. And Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, I think, because I read the book years and years ago, and I'm going into this blind because I didn't want to refamiliarize myself. I think he wasn't a character going forward, right? Isn't they mixing him with another mayor character in this? Or am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. In the book, because the book really is a collection of short stories, you get a series of different space captains. And I think Wilder appears in maybe 2 stories in total. But the strategy that they've used for the series is to use him as the main space captain. So any of the stories that had a space captain in, it's him now. And I think that's a good choice, frankly.
Yeah, I thought it was very effective.
Well, I think once you cast a larger name like Rock Hudson, I don't think he was at his full star power in 1980 or whenever this was made, but I think when you cast a character like that, it actually is a nice kind of through line through the series. And I think we're gonna go later in the plot line of David, the little alien boy. I think that was also modified a little bit. I think. Am I right to connect it to the first one a little bit more?
Yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot more connective tissue between all the separate stories here. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the stories that you're going to be talking about isn't actually from the Martian Chronicles. They've shoehorned something else in there. But I'll tell you more about that when you get to it.
Oh, cool. Yeah, they're very exciting. I'm very excited because I haven't read these, so I was very curious how close or far. I obviously get the sense they're very episodic. They're probably pulled from a bunch of short stories, but I was interested because I legitimately thought I might come to the second episode and there might be an all-new cast of characters, so I was surprised to see some of them returning. It's interesting. I really have no idea what to expect every time I watch this show.
But I think it works. They're just he's like the mayor now of the town. You're okay, sure, done.
I mean, we basically, when we started, it's been 3 years, I think they say, since the events of part 1. Rock Hudson's Wilder's on Mars, and he is sort of there in the way the last episode ended, he's there to attempt to in some way to save some remnants of the Martian civilization, as per Spender, the astronaut who tried to kill him, his dying wishes.
But despite his efforts, or in terms of whatever he's trying to attempt, like, it's still getting colonized. Like, I don't know if they ever mention, maybe I missed it, but do they mention how many people are actually on Mars?
I did not hear it either. I think we're looking at a few thousand, I think, is kind of where we're falling. It's still very frontier days, it seems like.
That city was happening, though, when they went into town later. There was a lot of people walking around, so I was like, oh, it's more than I thought.
Did you like the name of the first city on Mars, First Town?
Oh, was that what it was called?
Yeah, they kept around, let's go to First Town. I'm like, you guys put a lot of effort into that. I also like that at the beginning here, they allude to all the three expeditions that went up, because they've named like a bunch of things after humans. So I'm just like, even one of them's named after Wilder. I'm just like, well, you're not doing a great job protecting Martian history here if you're just naming it after every astronaut who landed on it. But it is very funny when they run down a list of just like, it's York Plain, Blackfield, Wilder Mountain, Spender Hill. I'm like, so many names.
But they also call the canal Briggs Canal, and he's the one who was obnoxious.
I thought that was also very funny, because it's like, he's A, obnoxious, B, he named that himself, and then C, was later murdered in that canal. It's like, I guess he gets it.
To be fair, I think it's pretty historically accurate, though, as to what would happen. You know, looking back, it's just like, hey, I'm the first person to see that tree. Guess what? It's my tree now. You know, I mean, so I think it checks out.
It is true. I was literally just in Quebec City, which is one of Canada's oldest cities, where, like, you know, France originally landed, and literally everything's just like, yeah, a guy got off the boat. That's named after him. A farmer lived there, so that's his name now. I'm like, I guess that's how it works. You just show up and you just take it. I think we jump forward a little. We're jumping, I believe it's to September 2006. So I think it's a little bit of a jump, since we sort of see that Wilder is now like the commander. And we meet the parents of astronaut David Lustig, who I did not remember, but apparently he's one of the astronauts from the second mission when they landed in the small American town.
So this is the part that I think they adjusted from the book, because I remember vaguely this plot line of, which, not to ruin anything, is sort of about the alien who is, his appearance is reflected based on who is looking at him, or it, I suppose. I think they adjusted this to connect it to the first story with David, which I actually think works pretty well.
Yeah, that's correct. And even to the point, though, that when I was rewatching this episode the other day, I doubted that he was the same actor. So I actually went back to the previous episode to see if he really was there on that expedition, and he was. But he was such a non-entity in episode 1 that you just don't notice him. I think they should have, if they're going to do that, they really should have cast somebody who would be recognisable. Mm-hmm. So somebody who's a little bit famous.
I agree entirely, because I was watching, I'm just like, I do not remember this astronaut on that mission. Right. I also was less like, I don't think he was on that mission. I think they recast someone. But you're right. Sure enough, I went and looked. I'm like, no, same guy.
Because he wasn't David, this astronaut. He wasn't the one that was sort of, for lack of a better term, the leader of that expedition that went and talked to the people at the church, right? He was just one of the dudes in the background who's like, there's my dog.
I believe that would have been the one who saw his aunt. He saw his aunt, probably.
Oh, he saw his aunt.
That's right. I think there are 3 who sort of emerge from the rocket ship initially, and he's like the third one. So you don't really hear anything from him. But far from casting someone famous, they cast somebody totally non-famous, because it's the director's son.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it's Michael Anderson Jr.
I like that. It's such nepotism that he even has the same name.
Well, I tell you, he kills it, sort of. I mean, he's sort of like a non-entity in this. It's not like he has a commanding presence on screen. But I think it's fine. He's fine as this kind of confused alien boy.
As deer in the headlights, he does just fine.
Yeah.
But yes, basically, this is what's happening. Is this astronaut's parents, Leif and Anna Lustig. Leif, who must be the hairiest man on Mars. I loved when he took off his shirt. I'm like, man, oh man, they don't make him like that anymore. They've set up a little house on Mars next to a creek I believe it might even be Lustig Creek. I think they might be on the creek named for their son. And they've come up there to honor his memory, I think is the idea, which is kind of sweet.
A couple of things. I loved that they're like living in like cottage country. They had to take their boat to town. I thought that was great. And also, this is the first time we get to really see the outside and inside of what these building structures and homes look like. And they're all sort of, I thought was a pretty good idea. They're sort of like modular homes, almost like steel kind of, they look like they've been purpose built. But what I did think was funny is that they looked very kind of science fiction on the outside. And then when we do go to town, you do see some like futuristic looking chairs and stuff, but the inside of this home of the Leif and Anna, it just looks like a 1960s home for some reason. And I just thought it was funny. I was like, does that match the outside? Or are they just like, they're like, we know the style we like, it's mid-century modern, and that's what we're going to decorate our house with, no matter that we're on the moon or Mars, excuse me.
I do like the houses too. They kind of have a very sleek silver, like it's almost like shipping containers, but like a futuristic shipping container you've shoved together. But you point out a good point. Like they have that boat they'll go to town in later, and the boat is very like sleek and futuristic, and then it just got an outboard motor, and I'm just like, it's very funny to me.
You know what the town looked like, Luke? What was that other show we just watched? It was like a 7-episode series, and they're like in the, I don't know, it was the future, and ghosts might show up.
Yeah, that British show. So it's so memorable.
It was so forgettable.
I've forgotten entirely.
But anyways, it was the same concept of like a colony set up, and what it would kind of look like is not what a purpose-built neighborhood here would normally look like. It's more things that would have had to be shipped. So the walls would have to be shipped, the floors would have to be shipped, and so forth. Are you looking up the show?
Yeah, of course I'm looking up the show. What are you gonna say that and I'm not gonna look up the show? No, Phil's loving it. He can't wait to hear Outcast. It's called Outcast.
Outcasts. That's what it was. Phil, you remember Outcast, that show that no one remembers?
No, sorry. You got me there.
It must have been very popular in its home country of Britain.
It must have been.
At any rate, let's get back to Martian Chronicles. That night, the Lustigs experienced a very big storm, which is, I really like that. Just like, they've just said, like, Mars is essentially like Earth, a little less oxygen, but don't worry about it. It's like a huge storm rolls in. There's no, like, no one explains why there are huge storms. They're just like, just go with it. But it's great. It's a huge storm. Things get really spooky. Like, this very much started off like a weird spooky episode. During the storm, Leif, he hears some whistling outside, and he steps outside, and in the distance, in the rain, is like his a man, and like what we'll come to learn is his son, and it's very spooky. And I'm just like, is this going to be like a Ghosts of Mars episode? Like, we're going to just have like spooky stuff happening everywhere. And I liked it. It was a nice tonal setup to the episode in some ways, because it was such a weird lost sort of way to start an episode of just like, what is happening?
And his whistling is what it is, right? Is it supposed to be sort of like a siren call? Because later on they sort of drop a line of dialogue that and either one of you, please correct me if I'm wrong, that he had like sung or whistled, and that sort of created some sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, not a mind wipe, but like a suggestibility that people would kind of just go along with the story of this person showing up that is clearly dead.
I didn't catch that, if that happened. So that might have been a personal reading, which is an interesting reading, but I didn't catch it if that was the intention.
No, I could very well be wrong. I thought there was a line of dialogue that like he said something time like, I sang to her when he was speaking to his mother, and that she then was really like buying it. But maybe I'm wrong.
I don't remember that either. You may well be right.
I may have dreamt it last night.
You make me want to watch the whole thing again now, in case I missed something important.
That really changes the whole game. Whatever Jordan just invented changes the whole game.
No, I'm probably wrong. But the point being, though, is that this is sort of the crux of this sort of little story, is that this person shows up, their son that has died, and the mother sort of wholeheartedly just is fine with it. Whether she's lying to herself or not, she's just fine with it. And the father is kind of wavering between like, do I just go with this because I miss my son? Mixing with the reality that he knows it can't be his son.
What I really like, Jordan, is that is what happens the next morning when they wake up and the son is in the house now. But when that night when they're watching her in the storm, the wife comes out, sees her son too, and she's freaked out, and she's just like, let's just go back to bed. And they both just go back to bed. And I'm just like, how did you both fall back asleep so easily? I don't understand. But yes, you're right. In the morning, it's like he's there. They're sort of just like, I guess we're just going to sort of accept that our dead son has come back to life. Certainly Anna Lustig, the wife, is very much, she's just so happy to have her son back. She's just not going to ask any questions. And his father is kind of a little skeptical, but, you know, don't look a gift horse in the mouth, I guess is the idea. And it's so funny because this is kind of where this little story leaves off, and we move away into a new story to come back to this later, which at first I was like, I thought it was a little odd, but I think it actually like plays well with this weird vignette structure, because that weird opening brings us into these two missionaries arriving on Mars, Father Peregrine and Father Stone. Father Stone, of course, played by Roddy McDowall in his human mask this time.
And am I wrong? Did they do something to his eyes?
I've never seen them before without an ape mask, so I couldn't tell you.
It seemed like he had like almost his eyes were like black contacts, but maybe it's just the video quality. We're watching this on YouTube, but I was like, is this going to be a thing? Because I and again, Phil, you're the expert. I know this was in the book, this story. At least some version of this was in the book, I remember. But I don't remember that being a thing. So I was like, maybe it's just something I saw. I was like, these eyes look weird. But it's neither here nor there because it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I just think he has very compelling eyes in real life.
Maybe that's what it is. I was just falling in love with Roddy McDowall is what it was.
I mean, that's why he was so successful in the Apes movies, is because of the eye acting that he does, which is absolutely magnificent, I think. And I think when you see him without the ape makeup, he always seems to be overacting to me. But there's nothing significant in that, I don't think.
No, I don't think so either.
As for the story in the book, it's in some versions of the book, but not others. Because
is that right?
Yeah, it wasn't in the original American version of the book, but it was in the original British version of the book, and then it was put into the American version, I think, in the 70s. So the whole text of the Martian Chronicles has been in flux ever since it was first published. And this
I didn't realize that. I didn't realize there was different versions of it.
Yeah. And it's really because it's not really a novel. Despite saying based on the novel by, it's not really a novel. It's really a short story collection. So, you know, it lends itself to having bits added or taken away.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's it. It's more like a shared universe that we're, even watching the miniseries, it feels like we're watching segments from a bunch of different things in a shared universe.
Yeah.
But I think this was an interesting storyline to have in this, because I think it was a more nuanced take on faith and religion and belief than usually is portrayed in TV. And really what it is you have these two, I guess they're priests, although I don't know why they're dressed like Franciscan monks in 2024. But regardless, that's how they're dressed in the future. And you do sort of have these two views of why they're there and what they think they should be doing to both the population and as a whole, because they're really there. It's funny because they keep mentioning that they're there to sort of like save people, or sort of like in this very sort of colonial Spanish going over to the indigenous people and sort of converting them by force. I got a little bit of the sense of that.
Well, it's interesting because they're sort of there to minister to the colonists, because no one is supposed to be alive. But that's where Father Peregrine kind of goes off in his own ways. He's heard rumors that some prospector had broken his legs in the hills and was saved by these glowing green or blue orbs. And he's very interested in meeting these orbs. And a little later in the story, when he's like talking about why he's so excited to meet these orbs, it sort of stems from what he says is he's interested in these rumors, particularly because when he joined the priesthood, his secret goal was to literally meet Jesus Christ in person. Yeah. Was his reason for joining. Which my favorite part is Roddy McDowall hears this and just looks at him like he's lost his mind.
You got to set high goals, I guess, right?
Absolutely. It's kind of interesting because you were talking about how Roddy McDowall tends to can overact. That is certainly a possibility for him. But he's playing the straight man versus this Dr. Peregrine or Father Peregrine, who's just like wildly like not insane, but he's just like wildly enthusiastic about everything. So they're very funny, like back and forth between the two of them, where the more time they spend together, It feels like they just met because Father Stone at every turn is baffled by the things Peregrine wants to do.
Which is the kind of the plot of this, because they're going to get met by what's his face, Wilder, who's sort of just like, I think Phil, you said before, it was just like a connective tissue. And that's sort of what they use him for. It's like he's like, hey, welcome to town. Anyways, do you need stuff? They're like, nope, let's go off into the desert. And he's like, see you later. So he's off. He almost gets, the only person who gets kind of less to do is his wife, and that poor actress has the worst role, because in 2 movies she just shows up and is like, souffle, and then she walks off camera. That's about it.
It's very true. I mean, in this particular case, they do go, they see some ruins, then they're like, we'll walk back to First Town, which Father Stone's just like, what do you mean we're gonna walk back? And you're like, come on, let's just walk into these hills. Immediately get lost in these hills, which is all Peregrine's plan. He's there to find these orbs, and of course these orbs appear very quickly. Peregrine is stoked because he's just like, sees them, they float down, and like, I think the first thing Peregrine says is just kind of like, I mean, this is not exactly what he says, but he's just like, hey, you guys into God? Because like, I can tell you all about God. And I laughed so hard because the orbs just like immediately start floating away. And I was like, yeah, that's what I would do if so I bumped into someone who did that. But sort of what happens is the orbs are there, they're real, they're not interested in hearing about God, and then a rock slide happens, they're endangered, and the orbs swoop in to save them. I think they scoop them up and move them somewhere else, and this sort of gives Peregrine the idea that it's just like, oh, so if these orbs know to move us, know to do something, then they've saved us. That proves that there's some sort of sentience there, and then this really gets him going. He now really wants to prove that if these orbs are sentient, then they must know about sin, in which case that they can be saved. And this is what he's really like on a mission now. He's like, can I convert Martians, these Martian orbs, to my religion?
I think it's even more of that. I think it's just the whole concept of what he believes in is broadened, because if we see ourselves as humans on Earth and there's this belief of Christianity or whatever it may be, that is based on Earth. And as soon as you go to Mars and there's other creatures or other beings, that version of what religion is has to be adjusted. And I think you get the push and pull between the 2 priests, because Peregrine is all for it. He loves the idea of Martians. He loves the idea of Christian Martians. He loves the idea of adjusting the church to accommodate them, which I thought was an interesting perspective. Whether that is morally right or wrong is another issue, but I thought it was interesting to see how his view was that he was excited about it. It wasn't like, I'm going to convince them to change their view. It's like, no, this is a larger worldview that we can have, as opposed to Roddy McDowell's character, who's more like, just wants to get home. He just wants to get home and do what he was supposed to do, which is, he's a missionary of types. That's all he really wants to do. So this guy's other view, they just don't quite jive together. I thought it was really interesting concept that they kind of play with a little bit, but I thought it was, again, it was subtle in a way that you don't usually see in TV, and so I like that.
I think it's even more subtle in the original story, because there's a little bit of going into the characters' heads and what they're thinking. So it develops them better as characters, but also their mission, their personal missions is a little bit clearer. But I think that the version on the screen isn't bad. It's not a bad adaptation. The only thing that doesn't work for me is when they're supposedly lifted up by the blue spheres, whatever those things are. And the way it's accomplished is that firstly we see them on the ground from above, and then the blue balls are superimposed on them, and then the very next shot we see them on the ground but we're looking up at them, and that's supposed to make us think that the blue balls have carried them up onto this cliff, and that's not what it shows. And it's expecting us to believe something that we never actually saw happen. And
it is a weird effect. I agree. I was also confused. I thought, because when I saw it too, I was just like, what? Like, I saw the orb go down to them, and then I'm like, oh, the orb's just like deflecting the rocks or something. Yeah. And then like they show you the shot, and you're like, oh no, they're up higher than they were. It's. I think like the effects, well, they look kind of nice. This like optical effect of these orbs, they are very limited, and they're not using them to the best effect for sure.
But the point really is that Peregrine wants to prove that there is sentience behind these lights, which he does prove. And then Which is funny about it is like it sort of was proved at this point. Then they go to sleep because they're too far out of town. They sort of make a fire, and then the orbs come back, and he's like, I think I really need to prove it.
Well,
and it's just
what he needs to
it's
prove
funny.
is he needs to prove they know right from wrong, so that to prove they know sin, so they can be saved from sin.
But it's an interesting thing because I don't know if sin. What was the sinful act? Killing yourself? Was that the?
I
that
think
the implication?
that is the idea. Because what he does is he gets up at night, sees the orbs, walks himself to a cliff, and then just like throws himself off that cliff, in the hopes the orb will swoop down and save him. And in doing so, he believes that will prove they know this was an immoral act and saved him.
It was a
from
literal
it.
leap of faith, which was interesting. And Phil, correct me. I believe that's in the book, right?
Yeah. And you're right. It is a leap of faith. It's exactly that.
It's funny though because I get it's a and maybe not terribly cinematic the way they filmed it on this because of budgetary restraints. But it is funny just if you think as in a character level. I'm like, there's a lot of other things you could try, as opposed to throwing yourself off a cliff. But it is that literal leap of faith. So it's like I guess he's going for it. He's all in.
He's very lucky the way they responded because they might have been busy. They might have
true.
had other work to do.
Or even if they were sentient and had intelligence, they may not have understood. It's funny. There's this idea that not only do they have intelligence, but it's the same intelligence that we as humans have. And it's just funny like I understand his concept, but it is funny to see how many different ways that could have went.
You're imagining a one where the blue orb they're floating there. They're like, oh, do you think it can fly? I mean, it seems like it's pretty serious about jumping out. I guess it can fly, and then it falls. Like, what? Why did it do that?
Well, I mean, we had heard previously that they saved someone who had broken his leg by moving him somewhere else. What if they thought, we'll just fix him after he hits the ground?
What I do like though is the orbs save him. Father Peregrine is stoked. This has everything you want to know. They know sin. They know right from wrong. They can be saved. And he immediately is like, listen, I'm going to come here. I'm going to build a church right here. But instead of a cross, I'm going to put a big blue orb in to represent the Martian Christ. You guys are going to love it. It's going to be awesome. And for the first time ever, the orbs talk. And the orbs are basically like, no thanks. No thanks. That's cool. We're good. No thanks.
I love that they didn't communicate in terms of, verbally communicate. I thought that was great. And I'm pretty sure it happens in the book too. Phil, you can clarify, but it's just that, like, hey, I'm going to do all this stuff. You guys really want this, right? And they're like, I think we'd rather not. We just like to float around, if that's okay. We're kind of beyond you and your church and your physical form. We just sort of float around. It's pretty good.
And you're right. It's in the book. It's in the book pretty much. Yeah. And this is one of the things with the book is the Martians are so very inconsistent from one story to another. At one point they are physical, corporeal, if that's how you pronounce it, beings, and the next minute they're blue balls of plasma that float around, and then they're ghost-like figures, and so it's very inconsistent. And I think in a book you can kind of get away with it, but in the cold hard reality of a TV screen, it helps if there's some consistency there.
I think they tried to connect that with that line of dialogue that the aliens actually give, though. I think they say, like, they've sort of evolved. A few of them are the old ones, and they've evolved to the point where not everyone has achieved this nirvana or whatever it might be. So they're kind of separate. So they've evolved beyond the other ones. I think that's how they kind of try to talk it away.
Yes, they do. You're right, yeah.
I do like that too, because they're like, yeah, we transcended our physical forms. It was so long ago, we forgot how. Don't ask. We can't tell you.
Yeah, there's not enough time. We've got to go rescue other people who are throwing themselves off cliffs for some reason.
I mean, but tying it back to kind of the spiritual elements of this story, like the orbs do say it's just like, hey, listen, we can live forever, and we're free from sin now. Like the entity you call God, we're very familiar with it. Like there's this idea that like there's a higher plane or something that they exist on, and they recognize that, I guess, in Father Peregrine's quest, and kind of are like, just head back, deal with your own people. But it's interesting, they don't completely dismiss the idea of like something beyond the physical realm with this. I expected it to be either like a hard religion doesn't know what it's talking about, or a hard like religion exists, and they kind of fall somewhere between that. It's an interesting concept they're pulling off. I think the subtlety to it, I agree. I think, Jordan, you were saying earlier, the subtlety was surprisingly effective in a story that I thought could go wrong in several ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. As soon as you had like two priest characters, I was like, oh, and I couldn't really remember until I had watched it played out how it was in the book, and it was like, I can see how this is going to go. He's going to have his faith, and he's going to lose his faith, and it's that sort of just trope we've seen over and over, and it's not that at all. And I thought, just as you're saying, this sort of spiritual concept, I thought it was well done. If not exactly like the book, but still, I think the basic core ideas are there.
I have to assume that a lot of the core ideas must be, even if they're not exactly as written, like, are pulled from the book, because like how this so far the show has dealt with colonization and religion, it's all much more thoughtful in a lot of ways than a lot of the shows we watch of TV sci-fi. Like, and the only reason I can think that must be the case is like it must be being pulled, like, this feels very literary. It feels like a much deeper thought on these things. And usually it's just like, it's the Wild West now. If it's a colony, it's just the Wild West, and we're the cowboys. Like, that's usually as much thought that goes into it. And this is a lot deeper thought-wise.
Well, it is what I think is this show's strength. Because, again, we know the special effects are not great. Some of the acting's not great. And to perhaps Ray Bradbury's point, it can be a little plodding and a little slow. But I do think the concepts and the ideas are strong enough that if you like that sort of science fiction and that sort of thoughtful portrayal of these ideas, then you kind of forgive the things that don't work as well, that, like, you know, the containers don't look great and the boats kind of float funny. You know, you go, oh, well, but the idea, at least for me, I think the concepts are strong enough that you kind of forgive those things.
Definitely. And I mean, this story kind of wraps up here. This is the end of sort of this journey, in that, like, I think Peregrine wakes up Stone at dawn, and he's just like, "You'll never believe the adventure I just had." And Stone's like, I just want to go home. And Peregrine's like, "Oh, I've known the way home all along. This was just a fun little side trip." And they kind of wander off. And I was just like, if I were Stone, I'd be so mad right now.
And Phil, how is this different from the story in the book? Because I know most of the elements are there, but what is different?
I think the only difference I can think of, without actually going and looking at the story, which I haven't done recently, is the title of the story in the book is The Fire Balloons, and it's because those blue spheres are supposed to be moving in a way that resemble fire balloons, you know, where you get that kind of paper bag and you light a fire underneath it and you let it fly up into the air. So there's a reference to that within the story, and I think I may have this wrong, but I think one of the characters talks about that as being from their childhood. So there's a little bit more character meaning within the story, but other than that, it's basically the same thing. It's really very similar. I like that they've kept the character names as well. Some of the other characters in this series have changed their name, but these have kept their name. So Peregrine is an unusual name, but it means wanderer. And that's what he is. He doesn't want to follow the main road back to town. He wants to wander off across the wastelands of Mars. And what's the other one? Stone, Father Stone. You know, he's rock solid. Doesn't want to do those things. He knows what's what, and he just wants to get on. So it's nice that those symbolic namings are kept.
Yeah, I think they're really fun characters. I was a little surprised how little Roddy McDowall had to do, so it makes me wonder if I'll see him again in an episode, if they found another role for him.
He'll be back, don't you worry.
Oh, good.
Unfortunately, he's also wearing his Planet of the Apes costume.
All right. Well, this sort of leads us back to the Lustig story. Like, now that we've had this like journey, we kind of know there's a little bit supernaturally happening on Mars. We can come back to the ghost of David, who's having a lovely dinner with his family now. They're sitting around the family dinner table. His mother, Anna, is so happy he's back. She's just like, "Listen, we got to go into First Town tonight. We got to celebrate that you're back." And David's just like, "Mom, I don't really want to. I'm like, I feel very uncomfortable going to town." And she's like, "Shut the fuck up. We're going to town." and he's just like, "Dad, can we not go?" And he's like, "Your mother wants to go. We're going." I was just like, this is a real family. There's a real family dynamic here.
Do they have an actual intention in town? It was just going to town, right? It wasn't like, we're going to town to see a movie. We're going to town for dinner. We're going to town for whatever it might be. They're just like, we have to go to town.
Mom's in a good mood. She wants to go to town. That's it.
Yeah.
She won't hear otherwise.
No, did we ever learn in this story, at any point, did they say why David showed up initially?
No, he just arrived. They see him out in the rain.
Right, because I can't remember, because this is the one that I think was muddled, for me at least, maybe it's just my memory, in the book, because I can't remember why he even showed up to begin with. Like, I understand how the story progresses, but do you remember, Phil?
I do. I mean, in the book, it's very similar. in the telling, but the atmosphere is very different in the book, because in the book they really do live out in the sort of countryside, and it feels more like a Northern European fairy tale than anything else. And it's just as the characters are going to bed, and you kind of imagine that maybe they're drifting off into sleep, and that maybe this creature has sort of been summoned up out of their dreams, their hopeful dreams. It's never made explicit, why he's appeared, but there is a strong correlation there between them having these sort of wishful thoughts, and then up pops this Martian character.
Interesting.
And that's the same really in the TV episode, because you see them in bed. And then the storm's raging and you hear the wind, and he goes out to see what's happening outside, and flash of thunder, and that's where we see David caught in the thunder. So it is a similar thing. It's as if it's been summoned up by the elements in response to what they're thinking about, which is very nice, I think.
There is clearly some connection between, you're saying, people's hopes and their wishes, whether it's conscious or not, because that's what we're going to see as we go through, is that he is reflected through... it's, I think, mostly people who've lost children or lost siblings, or they have this yearning to continue things that have been lost over time. He becomes this personification of that.
Yes, yeah. It's not entirely that, because there's also a policeman that we see later on.
Oh, that's
says,
right.
No, this is my suspect that I've been chasing after.
I forgot it was that classic, the detective who had the one case he never solved, gets to solve it on Mars. I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think this character sort of fits in, because we'll quickly learn he is a Martian, David, and he sort of fits into what we know about the other Martians we've seen from it. Like, we know they can take on human forms, and it's tough for them to leave them behind necessarily, but it's sort of shifting our understanding of them in that, like, I guess human psyches, because they are psychic aliens, the human psyche is so strong it can, like, forcibly push them into a role that they don't necessarily want to be in. Whereas in the previous one, we knew they used that ability to trick the second expedition into their deaths. This time showing that, like, it's funny, humans killed them with chicken pox, but now we're seeing, like, just like the human influence on these Martians are just like the amount of, like, trouble they're causing for them is, like, exponentially worse. Like, to be forced into forms by just something walking by. Don't
forget that he is possibly the only Martian left at this point, as far as we know. And so the ability of the Martians to control the minds of people, which we saw in an earlier episode, might be some kind of thing that emerges from a critical mass of Martians. It might be something that emerges from their social structures. But when you're down to just one solitary Martian, there is the psychic connection to humans, but there isn't necessarily the power there. And I think that's what we see with David, is that he's kind of victimized because he's totally out of control, and that's why he doesn't want to go to town, because he knows that he's not going to be able to control who he is. But obviously the parents want to go to town. And to go back to your question of was it ever stated why they're going to town, I don't think it is, but my feeling is that it's probably the mother more than anything, feeling that, we've got the family unit back together now. We've got what we came for. Now we can go and celebrate, but also we can go and show off to the world that, look, we've got our son back. And I think all of that goes unstated, and I think it feels stronger because it is unstated. And I think it's one of those few occasions where the series has allowed some of the subtlety of the original story just to shine through without actually laying it out literally in dialogue, which is what happens most of the time.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think all those emotions are underneath what's happening as they head into town. And it's fun. This is the first time we get to see First Town, as we've talked about it. It's got a cool look to it, and very dusty, but very frontier townish with futuristic elements. And they're sort of wandering through, and it's very crowded. Like, we see a lot of people there. I believe we see everyone coming out of a movie theater that's playing a future movie called The Silver Locusts. It's quite popular.
And do you know what The Silver Locusts is?
No, I don't. What is the Silver Locusts?
The Silver Locust is the British title for the Martian Chronicles. When it was first published. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was published here as the Silver Locusts, and it retained that title all the way through until 1980, when the miniseries came out, And to cash in on the miniseries, the British publisher changed the title in the UK to The Martian Chronicles so that they could say "as seen on TV."
That's very funny.
At the time the series was made, those people were going to see the film version of The Martian Chronicles.
I always love that there's this, I don't know who makes these decisions, but whether it's books or products or whatever, that someone has decided this works over here and it's got to be renamed over here, as if we're all that different. It's just funny, and maybe there is some polling or something that indicates these things, but it's like, why not just call it the same book? What does it matter? But someone decided.
Yeah, I think in Britain they were a bit snooty about the idea of science fiction in the 50s. So to call it The Martian Chronicles would be to absolutely signal what kind of book it was. So they thought, well, let's call it something a bit more poetic that disguises the reality.
Right.
So that's what they did.
I actually really like Silver Locusts' title for this series of short stories. I mean, it's a very grim title, but it's very accurate to like what it's about. Just the monstrousness of us showing up on Mars.
The plague.
At any rate, David, of course, being surrounded by these people, he's really upset. He's like begging Leif to stay close to him. But of course, David immediately gets lost in a crowd, and which results in Leif sort of going on he's running around. His son's missing. He's very freaked out. They just got him back. He's terrified. He doesn't want his wife to know he's lost David. And he bumps into Wilder, who's just out in the town that day too, as he does, just connecting all these stories together. And Leif's in a panic. He's like, have you seen my son? He's like a 24-year-old kid. He's gone missing. And of course, Walter's just like, he's 24, dude. Like, he'll be fine. Don't worry. He'll come back. And it's very funny because it takes Wilder a second to be like, hey, wait a minute. Aren't you the dad of that astronaut who died, who was also named David? And at which point, Leif like comes to his senses. He's like, you're right. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'll see you around. But it kind of brings Wilder into the story of just like, wait, that guy just said he saw his son, but I'm pretty sure I killed his son on Mars a few years ago.
I like I think, Phil, to your point, this idea that they wanted to go to town to not only create a normalcy they didn't have in their life anymore, but also maybe that hubris of wanting to show off. But as soon as reality sorts of hits, that everyone in terms of the history knows this person is dead. So that doesn't really work in terms of showing him off now. So not that they had time to think it out, but as soon as reality hits, which is Wilder's questions, like what was their plan? They're going to hide David forever,
But what are the chances that you're going to bump into Rock Hudson, the one man on Mars
That's
who
true.
knows everybody
That's true.
on Mars?
Yeah.
It was a big mistake on old Leif's part come up to Wilder that way. But it's great because then we pretty much hard cut into like this church the missionaries work in, and we catch up with Father Peregrine. He's back in town. He's praying inside this, like, the church is like real spooky. I really like the design of this church. It looks both uncomfortable and like where something bad's going to happen.
It's that blend of Earth and Mars that's not quite connecting.
He hears a dripping, and what it is there's blood dripping into the baptismal font, where that sort of horror imagery in this episode kind of comes back in for a moment. And as he turns around, he sees that Jesus Christ himself has dropped by the church, and he's finally living his dream. He's going to meet Jesus in person.
I thought this whole thing was really interesting, how they did this. Just the idea of, because as we're going to learn very quickly, it's David, and what we can see is that if he had control over how he's visually shown, he doesn't have this anymore, and it's too much. And so he's being reflected by whatever the person, either their wishes or whatever their hidden thoughts are. And as we mentioned before, Peregrine really wanted to meet Jesus in person, so he's getting to. The downside for someone who has to be Jesus is that he has him at his most ultimate suffering. So he's seemingly just come off the cross. So it's not, this isn't Jesus having a good time with the disciples. He's personified a body that is in torment.
Well, which ties in, of course, to the Christian iconography, because you have the Christ on the cross, and that's what he would have just been looking at that moment. So I think it's logical, and I think this is probably the best part of the entire miniseries, frankly, this scene and the way we're led into this scene. I think it's really very well done.
I think this is sort of an exposition scene, but done in like the most effective way, because here this Martian is now needing to explain to Peregrine is like, I am not what you see. Like, I know this is what you want to see, but like, I am something else. He's essentially begging Peregrine to stop looking at him so he can leave, because the longer Peregrine looks at him in this form, the more Peregrine wants him to be this form, which will keep him there. And as he's sort of bleeding from the wounds of Christ, he will die very shortly if he stays this way. And there's this push and pull where Peregrine, it's so hard for him to look away from the thing he's always wanted, but there is like a Peregrine is able to understand the logic of what's being said to him and clue into, like, this is not what I think it is. This is a Martian. A Martian is able to change. And he finally brings himself to look away and allow the Martian to escape. But there's a nice pull and push between the two of them that I was like, this is much more. When I originally turned around and Jesus was standing in the church, I thought it was going to get really hokey really fast. But it is honestly, it's an exposition scene handled so subtly and so well that I was just like, oh, this is a great moment within this episode.
And this whole section, by the way, is the piece I alluded to earlier that is not in the book. This is not from the Martian Chronicles, except in one sense, which I'll tell you about in a moment. There's a separate short story, which I think is called The Messiah. And it was published years after the Martian Chronicles. So I vaguely remember when this miniseries first came out, some people saying, well, that's not part of the book. What's that doing in there? But to me, it absolutely ties in perfectly with the story of David. It takes David's story to the absolute logical conclusion that if you've got this Martian who becomes whatever somebody is thinking about, this is pushing it really to the logical extreme. But where this comes from, this whole Messiah section, is from one of Bradbury's screenplays. So when in the 1960s he was trying to get the film made, when he wrote the screenplays, he didn't tie himself to the book. He allowed his mind to wander, he allowed the characters to develop, and he did create some whole new sections. And one section that emerged from that period of screenwriting was this interlude with the Messiah. Now, the films that he wrote the scripts for were never made, but he had the sense to take that little scene and turn it into a short story and publish it as a short story. But what's happened here is that they've brought it back in. So this must mean that Richard Matheson, who wrote the screenplay for all of this miniseries, Matheson must have known about that story. And I've got no evidence for this, but it seems fairly obvious to me that Bradbury must have told him about this other story that could be used here. And it's used without comment. You know, nowhere in the credits does it say based on the Martian Chronicles and the Messiah. It is just added in there, but it's so organic to the whole piece that I think it works really well. And also the casting. When I was watching it, I thought that's not the same actor. It can't be the same actor as David. And I'd forgotten who this actor was playing Christ. And I looked it up later. It's John Finch, who's quite well known as a British actor, and a very talented actor as well. So they made some good decisions around this whole little section. I think it really hangs together very well.
Yeah, that's fascinating because it's such a great connective tissue, both to sell this storyline for David's story, but also to connect back to the earlier Father Peregrine stuff. Like, this was a part where I was just like, oh, they've tied it all together so nicely here. And it's so fascinating to know that it was like a part of a screenplay that got turned into a short story that certainly Richard Matheson must have had access either to earlier drafts, or Ray Bradbury must have been very generous to like explain to him how to build this into a story. Really cool to know that was not part of either like any part of the original story. So
yeah.
At any rate, this is sort of how this sort of gets David out of the church and back into the world. And as this happens, Wilder drops by the church just to be like, hey, I bumped into Leif. He's acting real weird, saying something about his son. And Peregrine kind of explains to him that's like, oh, hey, I'm pretty sure I just saw a Martian. It appeared to me as someone else. And they talk about, this ties back a little to that first part where they talk about Spender and whether Spender may or may not have been a Martian. And we discussed this, Jordan, a little last week, is that when Spender comes back, there is this, like, they leave you with a sense that something's maybe off about him or maybe not, but could he be an alien, since we know the Martians can become become someone else. And again, here they sort of like toy with the ideas, like, was Spender a Martian when he killed everyone? It's a funny little piece that I'm just like, I don't know if they'll ever answer it, and I am torn about it. Like, I agree he was a little alien at that part, but I also think it's more effective if it really was Spender doing all of it. It's an interesting tease they do in this little section here, just at the end. It's only like a moment,
But to that point, and I think you're right, Luke, I think there is this nice concept of, was he just a human that had, was able to see further and see what humans were to do, or was it an alien or a Martian talking? The only thing the reason I think it actually was Spender is when he dies in the first episode, he doesn't fade away, Jedi styles, and I think all the aliens do in this. Now, I don't know if that's like just looking into it too much, but my feeling where I am is that it actually was Spender.
I agree with that. I also read it the same way, because we will later see David die, and when Spender died, he stayed Spender. So I was also like, I'm gonna chalk that up as is Spender. This brings us back to Leif, though. He's still searching for David. As he's doing it, he bumps into a pal. His pal's just sitting out front of a bar having a nice time, invites him for a drink. And Leif's pretty busy looking for David. But this friend is there to let him know. He's like, hey, by the way, crazy story. This other family in town, they were walking past a church, and that daughter we all assumed was dead, we even found her body that one time. She's back alive again, and they just took her home. Isn't that incredible? And of course, Leif knows exactly what's happened, which I like. Leif never fully buys that David's back, but he's willing to accept that this is maybe good enough for him. So when he hears this other family got their daughter back, he like knows what's up. He's like, that's the David we found. He's become something else. But I like, my wife she can't take it. She can't take David losing him again. So I'm headed over to their house. I love his excuses, just like, listen, there's got 4 or 5 other kids. I know they'll be upset, but it'll be cool. They've got other people. We don't got anybody. I gotta go talk this alien to come back with me.
And this sequence we're gonna see, weirdly, I almost felt more empathy for the Martian / David than I had in previous scenes. I don't know what exactly it was. Maybe it was the actress's portrayal, but I felt so bad for him, because he just seems so desperate to not having to keep going through all this over and over and over. And when Leif shows up, I don't know whatever the daughter's name was, but I just got the sense that she was just like, I just don't want to do this anymore. Like, can everyone just leave me alone?
I mean, that's certainly the idea, I think, is she's like, these family feelings are so strong. I'm already here. Like, Leif, I can't leave this. And Leif essentially is able to convince the Martian to come with him by being like, listen, we will leave the first town and we will never come back. I promise you that. So if you come with me and return to David's form, we'll just never come back here. The Martian acquiesces, hops down off sort of this balcony of this house they're on, becomes the David form, and they kind of becomes a chase, because they run off. The father of the dead daughter sees them and is just like, they're stealing my daughter again, gets his gun.
But what I loved about that, though, is he's like, I gotta chase them, but I thought, like, but he looks like David now. Why is he still chasing them? I'd be like, hey, you're just chasing 2 dudes. Your daughter, I don't know where she is. But he's very committed to chasing them and shooting a gun.
But is the Martian appearing to him differently to the way the Martian is appearing to Leif?
You could be right. You're probably right. I'm dumb.
I mean, but no, you're not. Well, you might be, but
no, he is.
But what we don't know is whether the Martian is physically changing or whether it is in the mind of the viewer.
Right.
And it could be either way. We literally don't know. But I think that little moment makes sense if it is that each character is seeing the Martian in a different way.
Well, and that's sort of how the story wraps up, is they run through town, get back to the boat, but there's so much commotion around this chase that like a crowd gathers around. And we get a really nicely edited scene where now David, the Martian, is in a crowd of people. And like that police officer who's been chasing this one suspect his whole life is there. And someone else who lost their husband is there. And every time someone yells, it's like, no, that's my husband, there's like a hard cut and David's getting pulled by the arm. And that cut, suddenly he's a different actor in that role and then a different actor. So there's like this really quick moment where I think that is the idea, is like maybe everyone is seeing him differently, or maybe every time he's grabbed by someone, he changes form. It's hard to say, but it's a nice moment where he's like really quickly like becoming 4 or 5 different people. Wilder intervenes and sort of pushes everyone back and just like yells out, it's like, you don't understand, this is a Martian. Like what you're looking at is a Martian. This isn't who you think it is. And in the tragedy that is this storyline, the Martian then like kind of collapses, I guess, from the strain of all the psychic energy, and on the ground he flashes between all the different people the Martian has been in that moment, and then becomes the Martian that it is, which is that sort of one we've seen in the first episode, big bald head laying in its drapey robes. And then it presumably passes away as it fades. I believe, as you said, Jordan, Jedi style, just fades out of existence. And we're sort of left with this moment where now everyone's lost the thing they were chasing, and this Martian dies in tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Possibly the last Martian too.
Possibly.
And then I was at this point in the story, I'm just like, what? Like, well, that's a real capper to this show. What on earth could possibly be left? And a very distraught Wilder goes home because, as to his character, he may have accidentally watched the only Martian who's alive left on Mars die again, and just another failure to his attempt to help Spender's legacy. And he walks in, he's so distraught. He finds his wife, who's just like, you won't believe what happened in town today. And she's just like, I don't care. Guess what came over the news just now? Earth's going to war. I believe it's going to be the final war. And I'm just like, wait, what is happening now? Like, this show takes a real turn suddenly again in this final act.
Yeah, and Phil, this last little sequence with I can't remember the character's name. I know it was Darren McGavin. Is this in the book? This whole, because I remember a part in the book where people look and see a nuclear war happening on Earth, but I don't remember a Western-themed space Mars restaurant.
Oh, it's there. Yeah, it's a story called it's called The Off Season. Whether he's dressed as a cowboy or not, I can't remember. That might be something they invented for the show, but certainly he has a diner, and he of course he is a character from the previous episode because we saw him in the Spender episode, and he's called Park Hill. And yeah, it's all from the book. It's all there.
Yeah, I'm sure in the book, Jordan, it says Sam Parkhill, played by character actor Darren McGavin, wearing a long, flowing, curly wig.
I mean, I love Darren McGavin, and but I'll be honest, like, and it's a fun little sequence, but it was weirdly my least favorite part of the episode. Maybe, I don't even know if I exactly know why, but I think it might be because there's so many nuanced and sort of lofty ideas throughout the show, and then this sort of was like not quite like a comedic beat, but it just didn't seem like it quite connected with the rest. At least it didn't for me.
Yeah, the tone is totally different to the rest of the episode, and we've already seen that we've explored the nature of faith. We've found possibly the last Martian. We've seen that if you push a Martian to extremes, you can get Christ. We've seen that last Martian die. We've learned that Earth is just going to war. And then we have the comic interlude with Darren McGavin in a sparkly suit. So the tone is totally contradictory to what this episode's been leading up to. And to me, that ruins it. Because it's been going very well up until this point. For me, it's the best of the miniseries until that Darren McGavin scene. They could have done the same story, but without putting in the comedy elements, and that might have worked better. But here's another interesting thing: the script for episode 2 did not include that story. That was in episode 3. So when Richard Matheson wrote it, it was this one was really all about the religious stuff, and that was all that it was about. And it culminates with the end of civilization on Earth, and oh my God, what's going to happen next? And then the final episode would have begun with the comedic story of Sam Parkhill, and I think you can do that. I think you can begin a new episode with a comedic tone. But no, in editing it, they decided that they'd shuffle things around, and so we get what we've got now, and it's very odd.
But I have to say, the thing I do like, though, is just the concept of the gamble of, I'm going to buy a piece of property in the middle of nowhere, and I'm going to open a restaurant because I know that eventually people are going to come. I think it's weirdly a similar plot to, if you remember the old Sergio Leone, Once Upon a Time in the West, I think has the same sort of plot where someone buys land because they know a railroad's going to come in.
Right.
But of course, it's taking that chance, and there's sort of that sad sack element to it, of like, you've gambled everything on a bad idea. There's something I think to play with there. I just think they are going for something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it just fits awkwardly after kind of the bigger ideas and the like tone of the rest of the episode. And now that you say that it was part of episode, when I watched it too, I was just like, this feels like a really weird, like it feels more like it's there to help us like prepare for the next episode and less that it has anything to do with the episode I just watched. So it makes a lot of sense now that this was the start of episode 3 originally.
Well, maybe it was just like they thought like the episode's ending and what a bummer. It's like next on's Magnum PI or something. They're like, guys, we can't have people all upset about this alien. Let's add a little sparkly cowboy, cheer things up for the last 10 minutes.
And what brings us there is Wilder basically, he's had a call with his brother. All the funding for Mars has been cut. It's all going over the war effort now. They're going like full on. This war's on. And essentially there's going to be one final rocket leaving Mars, or one final series of rockets leaving Mars to bring any people back to Earth who want to return, because this might be your last chance to get back to Earth. So Wilder has to travel to the people who are the colonists who are in the furthest places, who aren't going to get the news right away. So just to let them know, it's like, if you want to get on that rocket, you've got like 12 hours to get back to First Town. And this is why he goes to visit his dear old friend, Sam Parkhill, who, as we know from the last episode, really wanted to open a restaurant. He's opened this like 60s diner / future diner off in the middle of nowhere. As you said, Jordan, he's like, it's at a crossroads. When all the colonists get here, we're going to be filthy rich, basically. And
it's called Eros, is what the restaurant was called.
It's called Eros.
Yeah.
Interesting. Weird name.
I noticed it on one of the signs, the like fluorescent signs he had in the background.
And he's got a wife now. He may have always had a wife, but his wife is there with him running it, and she sort of I think she's game, but she seems a little more put upon because Darren McGavin seems to have gone restaurant mad. He's as you said, dressed like some sort of Colonel Sanders sort of analogous cowboy, and very excited to have this. And he's happy to see his old friend Wilder show up to like tell him about, like, to drop in. But when he hears everyone's leaving, he just won't accept it. He's just like, no. Tells his wife, he's just like, Earth's always about to go to war. It's not going to happen. The colonists are coming, and we're staying here. It's going to happen. We're going to get rich. Let's not worry about it. And big surprise for everyone, as his wife and him are hanging out in this giant empty restaurant, as we see the whole time, suddenly a Martian appears. This one more of a classic Martian we've seen before, in very drapey robes. This one's got a very cool silver V helmet he's wearing. Very cool. I assume at some point they'll tell us it's to help deflect human mind waves or something. But very cool V silver helmet.
We learned in the first episode, I can't remember exactly, but I think the one of the first stories we saw, when the husband was irritated his wife was having like sexy dreams about a human, he's like, hold on, I gotta go to put on my mask of conflict, and he went out with that, which is always bad news if you see someone wearing their mask of conflict. But I think this was as impressive as it looked. I think it was like the mask of property.
The mask of visiting a neighbor.
yeah, but he just misunderstood.
It is nice that the Martian appears and he's just like, "Hey, you Sam Parkhill, I've got a message to deliver to you." And to me, the wildest part of this whole thing is Sam Parkhill is walking around. This restaurateur dressed as a like sparkling cowboy is walking around with a loaded revolver, which he just like pulls out of his belt and blows this alien away with.
Well, and I mean, not to get caught in the weeds about this, but we've seen weapons in the future, and they're like laser type guns, right? So he has, if this is 2024,
this is all part of his character.
Yeah, it's part of his character. He's like, I'm going with this cowboy idea all the way through to the point where I have to have a loaded weapon on me at all times. And this is seemingly weeks before any customers arrive. So he's really committed.
I also was laughing so hard. I was like, a lot going on here. And I mean, this is all played, if not for laughs, somewhat comedically for sure. Like it has a dark element to it. Like we're supposed to feel badly he shot the alien, but I think the character Sam Parkhill is supposed to be a little bumbling. He's the Mr. Bean of Mars with a violent American streak. Right.
Well, and also that you as a viewer, I think Darren McGavin is a very watchable, likable actor. So you sort of inherently like the character, even though his reaction is so impulsive and so shocking to just, because I think we just said he just pulls out a gun and just shoots the alien. And you're like, well, there's that.
But it's great because his wife goes over, because the alien, like the last one, the Martian, disappears. So she goes over to a pile of robes, a big mask, and the thing the Martian was carrying to give to Sam. And she picks up, she's like, oh, it just seems to be some sort of message. And Sam Barkill's like, we got to bury all of it in the backyard. I don't want to know what that message is. We're burying it in the backyard. We're covering up this murder immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess they do that. We don't actually see them, but seemingly he did. He went and buried the Martian clothing in the backyard.
Yeah, he it's very funny. He just covers it up, and then like, I think kind of a few hours later, maybe the next morning, they're outside the restaurant talking about how great it's going to be when these colonists finally arrive, and they look off into the distance, and in a very like Dune-esque moment of this show, they're like, uh-oh. And what we're told are sand ships, which are just like big alien-looking sailing ships that are just sailing over the dunes of Mars. And I just kept thinking, I'm like, this could be a scene out of Dune or something. But they're coming in, and it's very like cowboy in the Old West. It's just like they're coming in, and Sam Parkill's like, we got to get out of here. They're definitely coming for revenge for that time I killed that alien. That time, 6 hours ago.
Yeah. So, hey, I had a question, though. So we see, I think it's about, I don't know, let's say it's about 3 or 4 of these sand ships that sort of look a little bit like a Viking barge, kind of, because they have sails seemingly for this Mars wind to move them. But he also has one, like the exact kind. So my question was, are they riding sand ships that Earthlings designed, or is he riding one that aliens designed?
I do have an answer for you, because they're like, we have to get out of here. They go to get in their normal car, but it's broken down, and Sam Hill hasn't got around to fixing it. So he's like, I believe the line dialogue is like, good thing I bought the last Martian sand ship at that auction.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
He just happened to have purchased one at an auction earlier.
You can fix anything with a line of dialogue.
I mean, this is where it's a very silly chase sequence that like does not tonally fit it. Like, it's a fun chase sequence, but it does not tonally fit with anything you've seen before. But it's like he's steering a sand ship. Sand ships are chasing him. He's shooting his revolvers off the side of the sand ship, just blowing aliens away left and right. And
I like it's done with miniatures. The miniatures are like 85% there. Like, it almost works, and it's just kind of funny when you look back, because the thing with miniatures, it's always funny, and I always enjoyed watching old movies, is when you have like cars falling over cliffs or whatever it is, but like they don't have the proper weight. So these boats, when they're going, and there's one point where it hits a bump, and the boat is just, it made me laugh, because the boat just, it clearly has like, it weighs nothing. It's like toothpicks. But I was like, all right, I'll allow it.
But they were so cheap that they didn't even correct that.
I know.
You think they would have looked at the footage and said, is that any good? Or do we need to go again? But no, we just got one shot at this.
He went, do you know what we're paying Rock Hudson? We're keep going.
It is funny. This is the most like serialized, like sci-fi adventure-y part of it. Like, this is like more of a, I don't know, what's that guy who's on Mars? What's his name?
John Carter?
Yeah, that's the one.
He also drives the boat with like what do you call it when you're like riding a horse? He's like
reins.
He's got reins.
Yeah, it's more like a sailboat or something, a very small sailboat where you just would pull 2 ropes to move the two mastheads to do it all. It's all very silly. Eventually, though, the Martians do overtake his sand ship. They board it. He like is forced to surrender, more or less, and the Martians are like, "Hey, we really need to deliver this message to you. I wish you wouldn't kill us all too much, but we don't mind. We don't mind you killing us all. Here's the message." And it's a very, like, they unroll, like, a metal scroll full of, like, an alien-looking language, and they're like, so here is the deed to almost half of Mars. This is for you personally, Sam Parkhill. You're getting the deed to almost half of Mars. And, Sam Parkhill's beside himself. He's like, I'm getting half of Mars. You're giving me the deed. It's like, this is great news for me personally. And he seems to ignore the second part of the situation where the Martians say, prepare for tonight. And he's just like, I don't care about prepare for tonight. I've got half of Mars, baby. And they mount up their ships, and they're like, we're never going to see you again. Here's half of Mars. Presumably, I guess they're going to go live on the other half of Mars. They're drawing a black. They've got their paintbrush. They're drawing a black paintbrush line across half of the room of Mars. You stay on your side. We'll stay on ours. And we end up back at the restaurant. Sam Parkhill's so excited. Not only is he sure the colonists are still coming to go to his restaurant to make him rich, he now is proud owner of half of Mars. And he tells his wife, he's just like, hey, pull up that periscope, our classic restaurant periscope that you can point at Earth to see it. Pull up that periscope. Baby, I bet you anything. There are rocket ships flying here full of colonists. Our ship's coming in.
I actually thought the as funny as the ships looked, I thought the effect of Earth here we're going to see, I thought was pretty good, because what you're basically going to get is that, without actually saying it, clearly a nuclear war has happened. Actually, they do show it because they show the mushroom clouds and stuff happening in a sort of montage. But you do see Earth sort of just die, is what we get to see, and kind of become a glowing nuclear ball.
Yeah, we're left with the idea that Earth, like, as they look through this periscope, we just see Earth become an uninhabitable rock in space. The nuclear war has come to terms. Humanity has been wiped off on Earth. And I agree with you guys in that this is totally a weird turn for this episode, but I've got to say, this wife who never gets a name the whole time gets to end the episode with a joke. She just makes a joke at the end of the episode, which I guess, Phil, as you said, if this is probably the name of the short story, but she like looks away from Earth. It's been destroyed. Sam Parkhill is like in shock knowing that everyone is dead. And she turns to him and I believe her joke is, I got bad news, baby. It's going to be an off season this year. And I was in hysterics. I'm just like, I cannot believe they just nuked Earth and they're ending on the joke of just like, it's going to be an off season. It's totally wrong for the whole episode, but I thought was hilarious way to end this episode.
I agree with you. I thought that was the best part of this whole sequence, actually, and I think partially because of the actress's performance, which is half crying, half laughing, realizing that their business is dead, but that's the least of the problems because everybody's dead. So there's such a dark, black joke to make, and I thought that was the best part of that
my
whole
note
sequence.
was, this woman rules.
She's great at funerals.
But that is really how the episode wraps up, which I was just like, all right, here we go at part 3. I can't wait to see where we're headed. But yeah, that sort of wraps it up. And I mean, I guess we can sort of talk about any holistic stuff. I think I haven't looked too much, or I've tried to look a little bit into the making of the show, but they're not a lot, and there's not a lot written in general. Like, certainly the Wikipedia is pretty light on details, and I'm kind of curious. I mean, Phil, like, kind of, do you have any sort of insights into about the making of this that we haven't talked about?
Yeah. How long have you got?
Oh, we've got all the time in the world. Don't worry.
Whoa. Well, I don't know if you noticed that in the credits, there's all sorts of people named as producers, and a number of different production companies are named, and sometimes you get a bit suspicious when you see so many entities involved in the creation of a piece, and you wonder, has that interfered with its ability to be any good? Because, this Stonehenge Productions, which is one of the entities named, may have been pulling it in one direction, and what's his name? Milton Subotsky, I think, is one of the producers. He produced the Amicus films, which are like horror films, but not as good as Hammer horror films. So there's all sorts of people attached to it, and you think, well, it must have been pulled in lots of different directions. And it was made by Charles Fries Productions for NBC, but with money from the BBC as well. So, it's all a little bit odd in the way it's set up. And then when you look at the people involved, the individuals involved, you've got Michael Anderson, whose he'd had a big hit in the last few years because he had made Logan's Run, which was hugely successful. But that was the last sort of big science fiction film before Star Wars changed science fiction films forever. And this is made on the other side of that. This is made after Star Wars. This is made after Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This is made very much in the era when visual effects technicians can do anything, and yet in the making of this they used people who can barely do anything at all, because you've got these awful sand ships, and there's some really terrible green screen work coming up in episode 3 where you've got Rock Hudson actually meets a Martian and they go to shake hands, but because they're both ghosts, or to each other they are ghosts, their hands are supposed to pass through each other, so they did it using this sort of green screen effect.
Oh dear, that's
terrible.
That's one of the things I've liked about these episodes is they haven't really done much green screen work. They at least tried to keep it relatively practical. So I don't like to hear that we're going to hit green screen town next week.
So there's all sorts of weird oddnesses about this, but the biggest thing with the production side is that it was the contracts were signed, I think, in 1977. So it was actually the year of Star Wars was when they signed to do this series. Bradbury, you may have noticed, got the possessive credit up front. So it's not The Martian Chronicles, it's Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles. So they paid big money to get the rights, but also the price you pay, if you like, for wanting to adapt Bradbury is it has to be Ray Bradbury's blah blah blah, and then he wants to have some say in it. But he chose not to write the script, but he still wanted a say in it. And I think you mentioned at the beginning that he stood up at a press conference and said that it was boring, which was not a wise move on his part. He also did an interview for a newspaper in, I think, January 1980, where he talked about the problems with the show, and as a result of that he received a letter from the lawyers of Charles Freese Productions saying that your contract forbids you to say this. So they were essentially threatening him. And why on earth would an author say bad things about a show that's got his name on there as a possessive credit? And it really goes to the cheapness of this whole production. Yes, it cost a lot of money, but they weren't spending the money wisely.
Yeah, well, you have to assume with that many producers, and clearly if he's negotiated his possessiveness over like Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, there was a lot of money probably exists above the line about how much was left by the time it got to production is a very I think we can see the answer. Yeah.
I'll give credit to Ray Bradbury though. In his defense, Stephen King has, at any chance he's had, he's mentioned how much he hates The Shining, which I always thought was so funny because it's like, you've made so much money, and the movie has ended up being much more popular than the book was, but he just hates that book and uses that at all times. So maybe it's just that difficulty for Bradbury of seeing something that was in his mind on the screen and it not quite reaching the same levels of his imagination.
Yeah. He did view early cuts of all 3 episodes, and he offered some comments in writing. But also one of the executive producers did the same, which is a standard thing for an executive producer to do anyway. But it's quite clear from those notes, which I've seen, that there were considered to be enormous problems with each episode, and the whole sandship sequence was condemned. This is the producer called Dick Berg, who is a writer. Well, he was a writer as well, and he did some of the polishing of the script after Matheson wrote it. But Dick Berg totally panned the sandship sequence and said, look, we've got to do this again. But they didn't do it again. They just lived with it because probably somebody controlling the purse strings said, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. But I think that the biggest issue with the series for me is that it's badly directed, except for 1 or 2 moments which are stunning. The first appearance of David, I think, is stunning. The sequence with the Christ, I think, is stunning. A few other little bits throughout the series that are stunning, but there are many scenes which are just badly directed with terrible line readings. And I can't remember any specific lines, but the Spender character in episode 1, there's a couple of places where he just delivers the lines totally wrong and the meaning is lost. But the director's not paying attention. And it's just weird that you've got somebody of the calibre of Michael Anderson who's kind of sleepwalking through the whole thing. And that's what I find most disappointing about it. But what I do believe is that with a good editor who was able to go at this based purely on the material available, I think you could make a fairly decent show. If you were to redo the effects, I mean, those have to be redone. But if it were to be re-edited from the existing footage, I think this could be made a lot better than it is, because it's very slow. There are lots of reactions where you see Rock Hudson sees a thing happening, and then we go in on a close-up of Rock Hudson while he thinks about it. And then he sort of turns as he realises what the meaning of this thing is that he's just been thinking. And then he walks off to go and deal with it. And all of those reaction things, they're just so incredibly sluggish. And it seems to me that they've got their 2-hour slot for each episode, including commercials, of course. And it's as if, well, we can't cut anything out because the episode will be too short now. So they've left all of these long, flabby scenes in there. And it's, it's painful to watch. I've got a DVD player which lets me play things at 1.3 speed, and actually it works much better. The Martian Chronicles is much better if you play it a little bit faster than it's meant to be.
Just give it a little extra juice.
Yeah.
We talked about this a little last week too. It is interesting. Like, you watch it and like, there's a lot of cool ideas that I think I really liked, and I think Jordan really liked. But it was also just like, it does feel like a different edit of it, or if you didn't have to worry about that 2-hour time slot, you would like, not only would you like trim it up and make it quicker, you would probably adjust where scenes play out, or you maybe would move, because often the stories play out individually, so they're not like cross-cutting between each other, and maybe there's a version that like works better where we can cross-cut between a few of the stories a little more. It is an odd piece, because there are moments that really shine that I really like, and I think you've pinpointed some of them from this episode where you can really see, like, we've watched on this podcast some really bad stuff where like people just didn't care, and you can see moments where people really care a lot in them, and then there'll be long sequences where it just they're functionary, they're just giving you exposition, they're just getting you to the next place. And so it's such an odd show to see, like, that whole church sequence, which is so well done and like well thought out, and then like other sequences where when they walk through town, it's the sloppiest like travel through First Town. Like, you barely get a sense of First Town. It is truly just functionary, but like, it could have been like an epic scene of coming to town, but like, whether it's scheduling problems, whether it's budgetary problems, like, that thing did not get to shine for some reason.
I agree with both of you, and I don't disagree that like this it's slow. There's no question, and it's pedantic and plotting. I sort of forgave most of it though, and maybe it's just my expectations were, I wasn't expecting Star Wars. I didn't think this was going to be a go to theater, enjoy your popcorn kind of thing. I knew this was going to be a more contemplative sort of thing. So I was just like, all right, well, parts are kind of slow because this is a slow movie. That's what they want. Again, I don't disagree with any of those points, but I think, at least for me, I sort of forgive it more because it's in service of some loftier ideas.
And I think that's a very generous way of looking at it. And I think maybe that's how it's going to be seen if this survives any further beyond this discussion today. I think that might be the legacy of this series. I'm somebody who watched it when it first came out because I'm that old. I saw it on first viewing when it was shown on British TV, and boy was I disappointed with the
Oh, really?
Yeah, with the first episode particularly, because that whole story of Ela and her husband doesn't really make any sense in the TV episode. But if you read the short story, it makes perfect sense. And it's just they've left so many things out that you think, why are you bothering to even do this? Now, after that one story, it picks up a bit and it does improve. But they seem to have started, the very weakest part of the entire miniseries is the opening story. And they really shot themselves in the foot. And that was one of the things Bradbury complained about, one of the things Dick Berg was aware of. And they could have reshot because they had the time. They delayed the original air date for this was supposed to be, I think, September 79, but they pushed it back to January of 1980. So they gave themselves 4 extra months in order to try and make it better. But I don't think they did.
But how do you feel now? So you watched it, 42 years ago, and now watching it now as not a kid, like, do you feel differently about it, or is it just sort of bringing back the same sort of feelings?
To be honest, I feel pretty much the same as I did then. There are some scenes which now work better for me than they did before. I think that most of this second episode works much better for me now than it did when I first saw it. But that's because of my maturity, if you like, my sort of more sophisticated way of coming at it. So I can see that when you're talking about it having loftier ideas than most TV shows of the time, I think you're right. And that's something that people like me need to bear in mind, is no, it's not as good as the book. We can't expect it to be as good as the book, but we can expect it to be good on its own terms. And in places it is. And I just wish that it was consistently good all the way through. But it's far too variable for me.
Yeah, I think that's a great summation of it. I think if you've read the book, you're probably going to come in here and be a little let down. I think for me, I was even only vaguely, I haven't read the book, and I was only vaguely aware this even existed as a miniseries till I found it on a list somewhere. It's like, oh, that might be interesting to watch. So I came in as a result with very low expectations, because the only things you read about are what a disappointment it was for everyone at the time, which I totally, like, if you had been sitting around waiting for it to come out and you were excited to watch it because Bradbury's name was on it, I'm sure they're pushing it as an exciting event on television. There's no way this is going to live up to it. If anything, the fact that it's kind of been forgotten in the last sort of 20 to 30, 40 years, like that it's sort of fallen, like it's not something people talk about as a classic. People don't go back and rewatch it. For me to sit down and watch it, I'm like, oh, there's, it's by far a very imperfect piece of art, but there's a lot to invest. It's meatier than I ever expected it to be. So in some ways, I think that is the bonus it's got, is by being forgotten a little bit. For someone new to come into it, it's just like, it's a bit of a surprise.
That makes perfect sense to me. There's one other angle which I think is probably worth considering, and that is that this is, yes, it's a miniseries, but miniseries was a thing back in the late 70s. You had shows like Roots, which I don't know if that was the first miniseries, but it was the first real blockbuster miniseries, shown, I think, over a series of nights originally, rather than once a week. And that made it event television. But miniseries in the late 70s were these big things with hundreds of star names attached. And that's one of the things that the Martian Chronicles does. It puts all the names at the beginning of every episode. So yes, you've got Rock Hudson, who's there every episode, but you'll also see Barry Morse. And Barry Morse is only in the third episode, but his name's there all the way through. So they've made this thing of signing up as many, I mean, they're not huge names, but they're all big TV stars, at least, of that time or of the preceding decade. So they've signed up all of these people, and rather than just admitting which episodes they're in, they've put them all up there in the opening titles. And that was the way that things were done with things like Roots and Shogun and Rich Man, Poor Man. And I bet you, if you go back and look at all of those other miniseries, with the exception of Roots, which I think does stand up remarkably well, most of those miniseries from that time were really quite plodding, quite dull adaptations of books. And so to expect the Martian Chronicles to be exceptionally good, it would be bucking the trend of what miniseries were at that time. As I say, with the exception of Roots, which it really was exceptional.
It's an interesting point to make of sort of like the conventions of the miniseries that maybe don't exist in the same form now, which is an interesting point of like they kind of were a little bit slow and plodding because they had to play over several nights in a row and you had to stretch things out. So that's what you get. And maybe it doesn't translate as well to more modern viewing.
Yeah, I think that's right. Having said that, with the Martian Chronicles, because it comes from short stories, you could very easily go in there with a pair of scissors and cut this up into, I think, half-hour segments or 21-minute segments or something like that. You could turn it into not a mini-series, but like a full season of short episodes. And many of them would work. You'd have one or two dodgy ones, but you'd have quite a few that would work quite well on their own terms, if properly trimmed down,
Yeah, I agree. Even looking through a modern lens, I'm just like, oh, it's mostly just an interconnected world of stories. Yeah. And I'm just like, it does feel odd. I'm surprised I'm not hearing about Amazon's Martian Chronicles. It feels primed for someone to build a shared universe sort of world out of. It feels like it's ready to go.
Yeah.
But maybe because the things it explores aren't really action adventure-y in that science fiction realm, maybe it's just like there's less want to do a more philosophical version of the show in a modern age. It's not going to fit the MCU model very well. But maybe you could do a very philosophical shared universe movie. I don't know. I'm not sure.
I mean, we've seen things like Foundation be made for TV. No, I haven't actually seen it, but Isaac Asimov's Foundation series comes from a similar sort of origin, originally written as short stories, then joined together to make a series of novels. So it's similar to what Bradbury did with the Martian Chronicles originally. So I don't see it as being an impossible thing in a streaming age to have a series based on the Martian Chronicles. In fact, I think it's very likely. I think it will happen. And we're more likely to see a new version under the modern methods of television than we were 10, 15 years ago. And I think it's now long enough in the past, this miniseries is long enough in the past that most people don't know about it, that I think it's something that you could resurrect and it wouldn't come with baggage. But even things that come with baggage, even things like Lost in Space, came with terrible baggage, has been able to be made into something fairly decent for the streaming world. So I hold out hopes that we will see a better version of the Martian Chronicles someday soon.
And at the very least, you mentioned Shogun, and I saw that they're redoing Shogun. So there you go. There's one more.
Yeah. Very good.
I think that this episode of our podcast will be the tipping point. I think this will push Hollywood back to it. Well, this is probably a good time. Phil, we usually do a little rating of the particular episode we watch. So part 2, you can treat it as the whole series if you want, but usually we focus in on this particular part. And I think that might make sense for you since I think you feel strongly about how this fits into the whole. And we do it much like IMDb is a 10-star scale, so a rating out of 10. And we'll start with you if that works for you. Do you have a rating out of 10 you would give the Settlers?
Any way you like it.
Yeah, I don't want to sound too harsh, but I think probably about 5.5 or 6 for this. But I do think this is the best of the 3 episodes.
So what would you have given the first one?
5, I think.
This is a very interesting. I as we said, we gave the first one 7.5, and I think this one obviously suffers from a lot of the same issues the other one has, and I think you're both right in that last sequence feels even when I'm rewriting my notes or thinking about it feels like a different thing entirely when we get to the Sam Parkhill side. But I'll be honest, this is still surprising me. I have no expectation, so that's definitely helping. But it is surprising me at every turn. I don't know where the story's going, and I'm enjoying the ride. And I'm having a good time. I'm gonna go 7 on this. I think.
Luke, it's happened again. I'm also giving it a 7, and it's not that I think it's great, because all the things we've mentioned, and it has problems, and it's not thrilling by any stretch. But I think I'm just charmed by something that is intelligent and thoughtful and nuanced, and for me at least that forgives the other things that are not that good about it. Like Phil, you mentioned, yes, not all the performances are great. The directing is haphazard at points. It seems like sometimes they don't even get enough coverage of things. It seems like they did 1 or 2 take. The special effects are not good. The miniatures are not good. All these things, and I know it's crazy then to give it a 7, but the scenes that are good enough that I just forget about that stuff, and I only remember the 3 things that were really good and really spoke to me. So I end up enjoying it, and I just kind of go, oh, well, yeah, there was a sequence with boats that really sucked, but I just don't think about it. So for me, it's a 7.
Very good.
I think those ratings are good. I think it really I think if you're coming in wondering if you're going to like it, I think it really depends on, your familiarity with the source material in a lot of ways. I think that'll really tilt you one way or the other on it. If you're, and I'll be honest, it's kind of nice watching these. I am now far more interested in reading Martian Chronicles now. I'm like, there's a lot of interesting stuff here that I'm like, I really do now want to read the source material, which will probably shift me perhaps away from enjoying the miniseries as much. But it's certainly, as an intro point, I'm quite enjoying it.
That's good to know. I think people who haven't seen it before and who haven't read the book really should watch it. I wouldn't, if I'm rating it lowly, I'm not saying that should stop people from watching it, because there is much to enjoy here. For me, it's more to do with the consistency or lack of consistency of the piece. I think anybody coming to this cold will probably find that there are some things there that they will enjoy and things that they will consider to be ambitious. But be warned that there will also be things that will make you groan and say, what are they doing now?
Counterpoint, Darren McGavin wears a sparkly cowboy costume.
every time we do this, I always am reminded that I'm like, Jordan and I have watched some really bad stuff over the last 3.5 years. So I'm realizing now we are also just like, our brains are now miswired in such a way that like things that are just like now like,
okay,
we're like, oh, this isn't like the worst thing I've ever seen. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, we mentioned earlier, if we don't cut it out, Outcasts. This is way better than Outcasts. And Outcast has a bigger budget, better performances, better special effects, better direction, everything. But this is better than that show.
That show just didn't have any ideas was the problem.
Yeah, that's the thing. That show had no ideas. This is all ideas with nothing else.
Well, I think that brings us pretty much to the end of the podcast. Phil, thank you so much for joining us. And if our listeners want to find out more about what you're up to, where's a good place to follow you online or a place to see your work?
Best place to go is my website, which is www.bradburymedia.co.uk. And on there you'll find links to my podcast. Well, actually I have 2 podcasts. And you also find my blog posts and a load of stuff about Bradbury's films and TV work and books and all that.
Oh, I think that's right up our listeners' alley too. When I was looking into kind of all the work you do, I'm just like, man, just all this Bradbury stuff focused, but on his like sort of media side as opposed to the book side. It's really interesting work you're doing. So I think people should definitely check it out. I think they'll really enjoy it.
Great, thank you.
But yeah, that wraps it up for the episode. So listener, you can always email us at continuumdrag@gmail.com, and on Instagram and Twitter. We'll have some clips. We'll have some sand sailboats chasing each other on there.
I think we should just have clips of Rock Hudson just looking and thinking, and just in 10-second clips for everyone.
Well, you can find those at Continuum Drag is the handle on Instagram and Twitter for that. But that's it. That brings us to the end of the show. So listener, thank you so much for joining us. And Jordan, I will see you next week.
See you then. Continuum Drag is recorded in Toronto, Ontario. Theme music by James Rex Seidler. Produced by Jordan Dullock and Luke Black. Special thanks to Aaron Hughes.